5,000 years. And as the Minister for Environment and Water, I'm committed to learning from this remarkable example. Thank you so much to the Press Club for having me here today. I want to acknowledge the report's three lead authors who join us today, Professor Emma Johnson, Dr Terry Janke and Dr Ian Creswell. I also want to acknowledge the Chief Scientist, Professor Ian Chubb, and my parliamentary colleagues, Michelle Rowland, Senator Pocock, and my old friend, Chris Hayes, who's come back to Canberra today. It's been just 6 weeks since I started in this portfolio, and on top of the usual mountain of departmental briefings, I've used these 6 weeks to travel to some of the most remarkable parts of Australia, reminding me again how grateful I am to live in the most beautiful country on earth, and how thankful I am to the generations of activists and good governments who have protected our unique national, natural and cultural heritage. But there's another story here too, a difficult, confronting and sometimes depressing story. At the same time as I've been seeing some of the most beautiful places on earth, I've been reading the data that tells me that these places are under threat. If we continue on the trajectory that we are on, the precious places, landscapes, animals and plants that we think of when we think of home may not be here for our kids and grandkids. Today, as part of my statutory duty as Minister, I am publicly releasing the 2021 State of the Environment Report. It's one of the most important documents in environmental science. Every 5 years, a group of independent experts, some of Australia's most respected scientists, a number of whom are with us here today, are given access to the best available tools. They're told to show us the full national picture of the health of our environment. Or as one of the authors put it, take a good hard look at ourselves. This report was delivered to the government last year. The previous minister, Susan Ley, received it before Christmas but chose to keep it hidden, locked away until after the federal election. And when you read it, you'll know why. But while it's a confronting read, Australians deserve the truth. We deserve to know that Australia has lost more mammal species to extinction than any other continent. We deserve to know that threatened communities have grown by 20% in the last 5 years, with places literally burned into endangerment by catastrophic fires. We need to know that the Murray-Darling fell to its lowest water level on record in 2019, and that for the first time, Australia now has more foreign plant species than native ones. Individually, every one of these revelations is dreadful, but it's only when you think about the cumulative impact that you begin to get the full picture of environmental decline. It's right there on page 1 of the report. I quote, "Overall, the state and trend of the environment in Australia are poor and deteriorating, with abrupt changes in ecological systems being recorded in the past 5 years. And it's downhill from there. Since the last report, marine heat waves have caused mass coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. Warming temperatures have reduced kelp beds along the southeast coast, as well as threatening reef habitats and the abalone and lobster industries that they support. At the same time, Australia is experiencing a plague of marine plastics. In Perth, scientists have found up to 60,000 pieces of plastic per square kilometre of water. In Brisbane, they found between 40,000 and 80,000. At the top end, in the Torres Strait and Timor Sea, abandoned fishing gear has been killing marine animals on an industrial scale. These underwater hurricanes of debris are known as ghost nets, and they're strangling up to 14,000 turtles a year, turtles which are listed as threatened. Our waters are struggling, and so is the land. As a result of erosion, deforestation, intensive agriculture and climate change, Australia's soil is now generally in poor condition, and it's getting worse. We're losing topsoil, letting it blow away without vegetation to protect it, making our soil less productive, less fertile and less efficient in holding water, which means our agricultural output is lower than it could be. Our land is more susceptible to drought, and our soil's ability to regenerate and support life is diminished. Australia is one of the world's deforestation hotspots. Between the year 2000 and 2017, Australia cleared over 7.7 million hectares of threatened species habitat across the country. That's an area bigger than Tasmania. Much of this clearing occurred in small increments. In fact, more than 90% of it was never assessed under our environmental laws. When we destroy these habitats and when we don't restore them elsewhere, endangered creatures lose their homes, and that has consequences. In February this year, koalas were officially moved from threatened to endangered in Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT. These drowsy creatures have grazed on Australian eucalypt for more than 25 million years, and it's only this year, of all years, that they've become endangered. Of course, this disturbing list is made worse by climate change. Global warming multiplies environmental pressures everywhere. It heats our oceans, it deepens droughts, it intensifies disease, it destroys habitats, and it worsens extreme weather events, which tilt the balance of ecosystems beyond recognition. The bushfires of 2019 and 2020 are still being felt today. Those bushfires were an ecological bomb ripping through southeastern Australia. They killed or displaced up to 3 billion creatures. They burnt over 80% of the Greater Blue Mountains area, almost 60% of our Gondwana rainforests, and more than 40% of the Stirling Range National Park. And they tipped clouds of sediment and ash into our waterways, leading to mass marine deaths. That summer was terrifying for anyone who lived through it. And if we don't act, those awful red nights will become more common. That's just a taste of what this report lays out. And for 6 months, it sat on the previous minister's desk. As Professor Emma Johnson told the Sydney Morning Herald in April, quote, "We've put a huge amount of effort and hard yakka into this, and we really hope the report can be used for long-term planning, immediate action, for changing our investments. But we can't start that work until the report is released." Well, I agree. And I agree that it's well past time we get to work. As we see from the State of the Environment report, the previous government was no friend to the environment. Too many urgent warnings were either ignored or kept secret. But there are other failures too. The former government made nice promises but rarely bothered to deliver them. For example, the previous government had a decade to fulfil the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. It's a good plan. Labor made it, we delivered it, and it saved the river system from dying in 2019. But it's yet to be fully implemented. By the time the Morrison government left office, they had delivered just 2 of the promised 450 gigalitres of environmental water. Just 2 gigalitres of a promised 450. And there was no plan to find the other 448 gigalitres by 2024 when it's due. The former government promised $40 million for Indigenous water, of which they never delivered a drop. The Morrison government made a series of pledges on recycling, pledges that the Labor government broadly supports. I think most Australians would be really shocked to know just how far we are from meeting these targets. and that the former government had no real plan for getting there. Again and again, the former government behaved in a way that undermined public trust in environmental management. They gave a private charity almost $500 million without tender or process to guide our response to the crisis in the Great Barrier Reef. It actually doesn't matter how good an organisation is. No one should walk in to the Prime Minister's office and leave with hundreds of millions of dollars they didn't even ask for. For 9 years, the previous government oversaw a broken, barely regulated national water market. The ACCC found that it was a market with no rules against insider trading, no requirements to keep proper records. This led to widespread distrust in the system. And as well as this distrust, there was willful damage inflicted as well. From Tony Abbott to Scott Morrison, from Barnaby Joyce to Matt Canavan, the Liberals and Nationals came to power with a mission to put the environment last, to repeal climate legislation and to slash emissions reduction targets. They cut funding to the Environment Department by 40%. And they thought that was pretty clever until they saw what it did in practice. Without proper funding, environmental decision times exploded. According to a National Audit Office review in 2020, the average federal decision for a new project was 116 days behind schedule. And of these decisions, around 80% were either non-compliant or contained errors. The previous government's funding cuts held back business, they damaged the economy, and they undermined practical efforts to protect our environment. In 2018, the former government cut the highly protected areas of Commonwealth marine parks in half, removing the largest area from conservation in Australian history. The Liberals and Nationals spent less than $17 million of the $216 million they promised to upgrade Kakadu National Park's infrastructure. And in their final term, the Morrison government's relationship with the traditional owners of Kakadu broke down completely, to the point where a government review, co-chaired by Amanda Vanstone, called it, quote, deplorable and untenable. The previous government was told, loud and clear, that Australian environmental laws were not working, and they did nothing to fix that. Almost 2 years ago, the Morrison government received an official review into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It was written by Graham Samuel, and the message was as blunt as the State of the Environment report. To quote Professor Samuel, the EPBC Act is outdated and requires fundamental reform. The EPBC Act is ineffective. It does not enable the Commonwealth to effectively protect environmental matters that are important for the nation. It is not fit to address current or future environmental challenges. I'm continuing to quote Professor Samuel, the resounding message that I heard through the review is that Australians do not trust that the Act is delivering for the environment, for business, or for the community. Professor Samuel's work was thorough, but it wasn't a revelation. The federal government has been receiving the same message for years now. And the central theme, over and over again, is around trust and integrity. People don't trust that the Commonwealth is protecting the environment. They don't trust the development application process to be smooth, on time, or without unnecessary duplication. And frankly, that scepticism is justified. Under the current laws, we don't clearly define the environmental outcomes we're trying to deliver. When we make environmental decisions, we don't ensure that they're being enforced in practice. And even if we wanted to, we don't have the data or resources to do it properly. And because no one trusts the system, these processes are often duplicated by state and federal governments, which delays projects, drives up business costs and jeopardises investment. And of course, at the same time, our environment just isn't getting the protection that it needs. That's what Graham Samuel told us. There's an almost universal consensus that change is needed. Indeed, business and environmental groups very maturely put aside differences to back Professor Samuel's recommendations, but again, the Morrison government chose to ignore that. They tried to ram through a select few changes and instead delivered nothing. That's the situation I'm inheriting as Environment and Water Minister. Years of warnings ignored or kept secret, promises made but not delivered, dodgy behaviour undermining public confidence, brutal funding cuts, willful neglect, laws that don't work to protect the environment or smooth the way for sensible development, all against a backdrop of accelerating environmental destruction. It's time to change that. Australia's environment is bad and getting worse, as this report shows, and much of the destruction outlined in the State of the Environment report will take years to turn around. Nevertheless, I am optimistic about the steps that we can take over the next 3 years. Legislating strong action on climate change is a great start. Australian scientists are world class. We know so much about how we restore landscapes, repair coral reefs and recover threatened species. We've got thousands of volunteers out there every weekend planting trees, collecting rubbish and cleaning up their local creek, many of them through community land care groups. Australians really care about the landscapes they live in and about the precious places that they'll never visit but want protected anyway. They just need a government that cares as much as they do, which is why in this term of government I will be guided by 3 essential goals: to protect, to restore and to manage Australia's environment. We need to protect our environment and heritage for the future. We need to restore environments that have already been damaged, and we need to actively manage our landscapes, oceans and waterways and the critical places that we've vowed to protect so they don't become run down through neglect. That's our agenda. To offer proper protection, we need to set clear environmental standards with explicit targets around what we value as a country and what our laws need to protect. This will require a fundamental reform of our national environmental laws and empowering a new environmental protection agency to enforce them. We need trust and transparency. Decisions need to be built on good data to show the public how we're tracking in real time, data that can be shared so we don't keep collecting the same information again and again, but instead we build over time a useful, usable, rich picture of our environment. We also need certainty and efficiency. This will allow us to speed up most processes so we can build new housing, construct renewable energy projects, lay the roads that connect our communities, better environmental outcomes and faster, clearer decisions. For too long, people have seen these goals as mutually exclusive. They're not. They're not. Good environmental law is also good economic reform. That's why, by agreement with the Treasurer, the historic wellbeing budget will also include environmental indicators. As the Treasurer said recently, it's really important that we measure what matters in our economy, in addition to all of the traditional measures, not instead of, but in addition to. Because this is not a conflict between jobs and the environment. We have got to go beyond that thinking when we reform our environmental laws. To help guide that change, I'm announcing that by the end of the year, the Australian Government will formally respond to the Samuel Review. We'll then develop new environmental legislation for 2023. We'll consult thoroughly on environmental standards. But in the meantime, I want to see an immediate start on improving our environmental data and regional planning, establishing a shared view around what needs to be protected and restored, the areas where development can occur with minimal consequences. I'm not naive. I know that improving our environmental laws is going to be challenging. People will have very different ideas about what national environmental standards should look like. And as Minister, I will probably make some calls that some people disagree with. But I am absolutely determined to improve the system. The truth is that everyone will have to give a bit to achieve real, lasting national progress. It's encouraging to know that groups with very different interests work to find common ground during the Samuel Review. Business, industry, environmentalists, scientists, traditional owners, farmers, unions, and your standard keen bushwalker like me came to the table to see what kind of progress could be made. I want to work across the board to build on that goodwill, because ambition is really important, but it's not much good without achievement. I understand that campaigns to stop individual projects will motivate and energise some people. Others will want to focus on a particular species or a particularly beautiful place. I know these campaigns can capture the public imagination, but in my judgment, what the environment really needs is a changed system. That's the message from the Samuel Review. That's the message from the State of the Environment report. Without structural change, we'll be resigning ourselves to another decade of failure without the tools we need to arrest our decline. We all want to pass on a healthy environment to our children and grandchildren. And that's why I'm also happy to announce today that we will expand Australia's national estate. Our government will set a goal of protecting 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030. We'll explore the creation of new national parks and marine protected areas, including by pursuing the East Antarctic Marine Park. This will be the latest chapter in a very proud Labor story. Labor protected Kakadu, the Daintree, the Great Barrier Reef, Antarctica, and the Tasmanian World Heritage Area. And as Minister, I intend to add to that legacy. The State of the Environment report also makes it clear that we have to do a better job of repairing environmental damage. Too much clearing of habitat has already occurred. Too many ecosystems and species are under threat. We can't just stop future destruction, although this is essential and the most cost-effective way to address the environmental crisis. We also need to actively repair past damage. The Australian Land Conservation Alliance estimates that we need to spend over $1 billion a year to restore and prevent further landscape degradation. The scale of this challenge means that governments can't do it alone. We need to work with industry and with philanthropic partners, many of whom are already doing terrific work. I want to look at ways of making this investment easier to support land-based carbon projects that deliver biodiversity, improve drought resilience and drive agricultural productivity, and to ensure that we prioritise the most important areas for ecological restoration. Better data, laws that focus on outcomes and good regional planning will help protect and restore the places with the greatest carbon and biodiversity value. We'll also support investment in blue carbon projects, restoration of mangroves, tidal marshes and seagrasses that provide habitat for marine life, support our fisheries and protect our coastlines from rising waters and storm surges. An Australian scientist described these places as the blue diamond of carbon storage. And he's right, these environments are precious, absorbing carbon at up to 5 times the rate of tropical rainforests and storing it for thousands of years. The state of the environment also tells us the urgent need to better manage our waste and to actively manage the places that we have vowed to protect. These are areas of clear community interest. Most people want to reduce their plastics footprint. They want to recycle the things that they've used, and they want a government to help them do it as easily as possible. I'm really genuinely excited by our prospects here. We can reduce pollution, we can increase recycling, and we can support local manufacturing at the same time. Just recently, for example, I visited the Samsara lab at the Australian National University, where researchers are using enzymes to break down plastics so that they can infinitely recycle those molecules to make new plastic. I've seen the research the University of Technology in Sydney is doing on making plastics out of algae. It's really fascinating work, and these are just a couple of the examples of the brilliant science that's being done around the country. I want to support these efforts to replace petrochemical products while working with the states and territories to encourage a circular economy. That means promoting recycling, reusing and repairing as much as possible. We know how important this issue is to our friends in the Pacific. At the UN's Oceans Conference last month, our Pacific family told me about the impacts that plastics are having on their health, their environment and their livelihoods. It's an area where Australia can forge really strong regional partnerships. As I said to the Pacific leaders, I want to see a plastics-free Pacific in our lifetime. Every Pacific leader I've spoken with is eager to work with Australia on this project, to share what we know with each other. There's also the question of managing the land that we've promised to protect. Here I see the environment and water portfolio absolutely going hand in hand with Labor's reconciliation agenda. First Nations Australians have managed this country for 65,000 years, and they did it through changing seasons, shifting climates and across radically different environments. These systems of environmental knowledge have been passed down for thousands of generations, and any modern conservation program should incorporate them. And that's why the Labor government will double the number of Indigenous ranges by the end of the decade to 3,800, and will significantly increase funding for Indigenous protected areas. We'll deliver the $40 million of Indigenous water promised by the Morrison government in 2018 but never produced, and will make it easier for First Nations Australians to protect their cultural heritage. We've committed to introduce standalone cultural heritage legislation, which will co-design with the First Nations Heritage Protection Alliance. A healthy environment sits at the heart of our national legacy, and it feeds our national soul. Our sense of ourselves, our health as a society is bound up with the health of our land and our water. Australians know how lucky we are to live in this country. It's the feeling that you get when you're coming home after a time away. You see it with fresh eyes and fresh appreciation. The crystal blue sky, clearer than anywhere else in the world, the glimmer and sparkle of Sydney Harbour, the long green stretches of National Park bordering our cities, the perfect ring of beaches that meet the sea, or the corrugated red ridges of Central Australia. Every time that same feeling, that feeling of home stirring inside us. That's our natural heritage. That's what we're committed to protecting. In 2022, Australians voted for the environment. They voted for action on climate change. They voted for their children and their grandchildren and every generation of Australians who will follow us. When you change the government, you change the country. After a lost decade, after a decade of going backwards, we can't waste another minute. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much for your address today. If you would like, once you've had a sip of water, to return to the lectern to answer the questions. But just to start off, the report sort of lays bare, really, the problems that we are confronting as a nation, and it concludes that there is insufficient overall investment and a lack of coordination to adequately address it. So I guess at the heart of this are two questions. How much is the Commonwealth prepared to actually spend to turn this around? And acknowledging the limitations of the Commonwealth's power, how are you going to convince the states and territories to cooperate here? Because ultimately a national approach is what's needed, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Well, the first thing to say is we've already made some very substantial commitments for additional funding. We will spend $1.2 billion to restore and repair the Great Barrier Reef. We'll spend about $250 million on threatened species. We've made a range of commitments already, and I'll be implementing those commitments. That's the very first step. On the question of cooperation with the states and territories, look, I actually see an enormous amount of goodwill here. There's a lot of environmental organisations here in the room today. There's a lot of business groups here in the room today. I've been so impressed by the common ground that has already been found in the proposals to reform our environmental laws that came from Professor Graham Samuel. I've spoken to my state and territory counterparts. They're up for change too. They want to cooperate. They want to see better environmental outcomes and faster, better decision making as well. So I'm very hopeful. I mean, I've been a federal minister before. I've had to deal with state and territory governments before, and I've always managed to find a cooperative way through these big reforms. We have to do it in the interests of our nation. We have to.
All right, well, let's go to questions, and Sarah Ison from The Australian will start off.
Sarah Ison from The Australian. I just wanted to start on Labor's 43% emission target, which it wants to legislate as soon as next week. Anthony Albanese's been pretty clear. He doesn't want to negotiate on that number. Is that good enough now for Labor to say, look, we don't want to come to the table and negotiate on this with parties like the Greens, given that everything this report finds? And Sarah Hanson-Young said that when coal and gas projects are assessed under federal law, they need to be assessed for how their emissions would impact the environment. Do you agree and think there's any merit in that idea?
Okay. The first thing on the 43% target, we made a promise to the Australian people. We're going to keep the promise we made to the Australian people. It's important that we do that as a government. I'm really delighted that one of the first things that we'll do as a new government is legislate higher ambition on climate change policies. I'm proud of that, and of course we'll work cooperatively with all of the crossbench, and indeed with the Liberals and Nationals. It would be terrific if we got maximum consensus on the carbon pollution reduction target and the other elements of the legislation that we're taking to the Parliament. But we've got to keep our promise to the Australian people. And on the issue of what some people are calling the climate trigger in environmental laws, I'd say the starting point for the environmental law process that we'll be looking at is the work that's been done by Professor Graham Samuel. He did consider, a climate trigger, as some people are calling it, and his view was that there are other laws that deal with issues around climate change, including carbon pollution reduction, and that's the proper place there. Of course, the process of reforming our environmental laws and reforming the mechanisms we have for enforcing those laws is going to be a really important listening time for me as a minister, and I'm certainly not going to stand here 6 weeks into the job and start ruling things in or ruling things out. But I would say if people want to know the direction we're heading in with environmental law reform and reform of the institutions that deliver on those laws, they should start by looking at the work of Professor Graham Samuel.
Our next question is Mike Foley from SMH and The Age.
Thanks, Minister. Mike Foley from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. You say that you're not going to rule things in or rule things out at this stage, Just going back to the Samuel review, he said that there was an urgent need for national standards, but particularly on the regional forestry agreements that control logging in that's done by state-run corporations, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, and he found that there was a big carve-out that wasn't working. Essentially, national standards were not being imposed or upheld in those states, and logging has been found in the State of the Environment report and many peer-reviewed studies to contribute to extinction risks. We've seen koalas and greater gliders being listed as endangered recently. So with national standards not being on the horizon until 2023, according to your announcement, is it your judgment that, have you ruled in essentially that those species can wait that long, or will there be national standards imposed on that particular issue before then?
Well, thanks for that question. As I say, 6 weeks into the job, I'm not going to start ruling things in or out, and I haven't even begun to do the amount of consultation that I want to do with state and territory governments, with environmental and business stakeholders on some of these big questions. I'd note that those regional forestry agreements are all coming up for renegotiation in coming years, and those conversations with state and territory governments will be important conversations to have. I take the issue of threatened species and the risk of extinctions very seriously. It was me that recently listed the greater glider that you've just referred to, and that's why we've set aside a substantial extra amount of funding for threatened species, for dealing with threatened species. But I go back to something else that I said in the report. This is something that will absolutely need environmental law reform. It will need institutional reform to make sure that when we change our laws, we're actually enforcing the law properly and we're resourcing that enforcement properly. But it's also going to need clearer settings for business, for industry, for philanthropic groups, for others that are doing amazing work in habitat protection and restoration. That's all part of the picture.
But it found that the existing laws are not being upheld at the moment, so do you see a need for greater action from the federal government to impose just the existing standards at the moment?
Well, I think absolutely people should respect the existing laws.
Our next question, Melissa Clark from ABC News.
Thanks, Minister. Melissa Clark from ABC. With your Water Minister hat on, you mentioned the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We have 2 years to meet the water savings under the current deadlines. It's pretty hard to see how that can be achieved in such a short time frame. Do you believe that state governments need to change their criteria for buybacks to meet that? And if that criteria isn't changed, will it be possible to meet those buybacks? And at risk of enduring the wrath of the moderator, just one other quick question. The next
part two of my question. Yes, go on.
As we say, the next Global Biodiversity Conference in Montreal later on this year, COP15, is coming up. Will you be attending? How much of a priority is it for the Albanese government? What targets are you looking for in order of ending extinction and biodiversity?
I think that's parts 1 through 7, but if you
This actually reminds me of one of Kevin Rudd's press conferences. That's point 3 subsection Roman numeral X.
I'm sure you've been doing a lot of studying in the last few weeks.
On the biodiversity conference in Montreal, I'd like to attend. That's around the period of our economic statement, so I'll have to judge what might be keeping me here in Canberra. But certainly Australia will be sending a delegation. One of the most important commitments that our international community are looking for from that conference is this broader adoption of the 30 by 30 target. So 30% of land, 30% of water protected by 2030. And I have told you today that we are absolutely committed to reaching that target. On the earlier question about the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and specifically about environmental water flows, I'm actually gobsmacked at how badly we're doing as a nation on meeting that target. Like, I have to confess, perhaps I should have known. I didn't know how far behind we were on meeting those environmental flows until I took on this portfolio. And yes, absolutely, we're going to have to lift our game as a Commonwealth, negotiating with the states. The states will absolutely have to lift their games. I have had conversations with all of the relevant water ministers. I'm not going to go into those conversations today other than to say...
Please do.
Yes, no, thank you. Other than to say they understand that it is a real priority of the Commonwealth Government to meet all of the commitments made in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. The 450 gigalitres of environmental water by 2024, I think it is extremely challenging to meet that target and to meet it on the timeframes that have been set. I think it will be, well, I have to be honest with you, next to impossible, given where we're starting from, how far behind we are. It is a serious area of reform for me. And I think the states understand that that is the position of the new government.
Right, our next question, Jacob Grieber from the Australian Financial Review.
Jacob Grieber from the Australian Financial Review. Minister, I think I listened carefully enough to your speech when you talked about the EPA. You didn't use the word independent when you described the EPA. That is in Labor's policy document before the election that you revealed to us sort of 24 hours before polls opened. Has that changed? Is independent no longer an important word? And related to that, you talked about balancing jobs.
Part two of my question, yes, go
Very
on.
much part of the same thing. Jobs versus the environment. You said it shouldn't be a binary thing. That should be managed, and both of those things should be taken into account. To me, that strikes me as a very political task, managing that distinction between getting projects approved, making sure the laws, the environmental laws, are properly respected, and there's a consequence for people who break those laws. So when you say you want those two things to be managed, how would you do it if it's to be truly independent?
Well, yes, we do support an independent EPA, but the design of that, well, there's a lot of consultation to be done before I come back to you with a final design. The specific roles that the EPA will have, and the way it's constituted. I'll talk to you again in a few months about that. I'll release an exposure draft. People will be able to comment. There'll be a lot of opportunities for people to make their views known on the form and roles that an appropriately independent environmental protection agency will...
The report's been out 2 years now, you said so yourself. Labor's been in opposition for 9 years.
Yeah, I've been the minister
surely
for
there's a more
6
distinctive...
weeks.
It's your government, it's your policy.
Yes, and I've been the minister for 6 weeks, thanks. On the other issue, I have to really disagree with that. You're saying that it's a political job to balance jobs versus environment, and I think that's the problem we've had. I actually think the job of government is to set up laws and institutions that work to meet the objectives that we make public. So we will make public our objectives. What are they? Protect these particularly sensitive areas, make sure that we don't have unnecessary duplication in assessing projects. There'll be a range of objectives that we will make public, and then we will consult on the mechanisms for meeting those objectives, the sort of legal changes we need to make, the sort of institutions we need to enforce any changes we make, the resourcing required to do it. I'd actually really like to take the politics out of this decision making. Instead of having people like Matt Canavan running around the country saying, I've never seen a coal mine that I don't want to make bigger, perhaps we need to thoughtfully assess using the laws and processes we have in a transparent way, in a way that gives the public confidence that our legal system's working appropriately, maybe we could assess projects that way instead.
Right, next question, Tom Connell from Sky.
Thanks, Minister. The report suggests there's somewhat of a flaw in our current environmental approval process in that if you look at 3 different projects that all affect one waterway or one habitat, individually they're not seen as having a big enough effect to say, no, they can't go ahead or to change them. Yeah. But if they were considered in a cumulative sense, they'd say that's too big an impact. It's going to affect this habitat. Do you see that as a fundamental issue and one that you would seek to fix in the overhaul of the approval process?
Look, I think it's one of the reasons that we've seen the scale and the rate of environmental decline that we've seen. But I think the way that we address that in any legislative reforms and institutional reforms we make is something that we need to consult on very widely.
So are you saying you would address it or you're not sure?
No, I'm saying that we need to find a way of addressing it, but we need to find an efficient way of doing that that has integrity and transparency.
Right, Pablo Viñales from SBS.
Pablo Viñales, SBS, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the 2030 target. You said the Labor government obviously made a promise to the Australian people before the next election, but you obviously didn't know what was in this report before you came into office. Now it's been described as shocking, difficult and confronting. Does what this report show you not give you enough of a message to say perhaps we need to reassess this target?
I think this report would give anyone who reads it a very strong message that we need to do better on the environment. I don't think the only way we do better on the environment is it's not just about the size of the land or water that we protect. That's an important part of it. It's about having a representative lot of ecosystems that we're covering. It's about choosing the areas that are most vulnerable and most precious. So it's not our proposal to go beyond a target of 30% of land, but that doesn't mean we don't have really high ambition to protect, beautiful, unique, vulnerable ecosystems.
Our next question is Ashley Wick from Channel 9.
Thanks, Minister. Ashley Wick from Channel 9. Experts say that the level of deterioration we've seen in this report is and was preventable. You say the government will now consult on the issues we're facing, how we fix those issues, but of course that will take time. Exactly how soon will we see practical action on the ground, and I guess how soon will we see the effects of this?
Well, for practical action, yesterday. We, as a new government, are already moving on a range of issues that we just talked about, the listing of the Greater Glider a couple of weeks ago. I've made a series of announcements about better environmental protections, greater investment in water saving the Murray-Darling Basin. A range of announcements that we've already made. As for legislative change, I think it's really important to do this properly. What we're trying to do is a once-in-a-generation reform of our environmental laws. The Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is something brought in by the Howard government in 1999. When we change this, I hope the changes will last for decades. They will deliver better environmental protections and they'll deliver faster, clearer decision-making processes. But we're only going to have one go at this. So I need to make sure that they're the right changes that I'm proposing and that we take people with us. If I could get the whole Parliament to agree to this, that would be brilliant, because that's the way that we have lasting reform in this country.
Doug Dingwall from the Canberra Times.
Doug Dingwall from the Canberra Times. Minister, thanks for your address. The State of the Environment report notes the challenge of reducing emissions for Australia. The ACT government is planning to ban new fossil fuel-powered light vehicles in the ACT from 2035, the first Australian jurisdiction to announce a phase-out of internal combustion engines in this way. Do you support such an approach to boosting electric vehicle use and phasing out fossil fuel transport? And does the federal government need to set its own date for a ban to stop jurisdictions adopting inconsistent stances on fossil fuel-powered vehicles?
Well, I'm really proud of the policies that the Albanese government announced around electric vehicles before the election, which includes making it cheaper to buy an electric vehicle. So many Australians say they'd love to buy one, they can't afford one. And so reducing the cost of electric vehicles is really important. Doing things like the hydrogen highways that we're investing in with state and territory governments as well, making sure that we're expanding the usability of hydrogen-powered transport vehicles on common transport routes. It's another great way that we can reduce vehicle emissions. ACT government's absolutely able to go beyond what the federal government's committed to, but as a federal government, we deliver on our election commitments.
Amanda Kopp from National Radio News.
Hello, Minister. Thank you so much for your speech. Amanda Kopp from National Radio News and the Community Radio Network. Labor was at the forefront of criticism over the destruction of the Juukan Gorge in WA. It now seems like history is potentially about to repeat itself in the case of the Burrup Peninsula or the Murujuga in WA, with a new urea plant which is planned for that area. Aboriginal elders today in particular, but previously, have been pleading with you now to intervene. Will you make moves to protect that cultural heritage site?
Thank you for that question. The Juukan Gorge destruction is one of the most shameful chapters in Australian history, and I think it's extraordinary that the previous government never responded to the report on the destruction of Juukan Gorge, because it did point to areas where we need to improve protections. That is the reason that we're committed to doing standalone cultural heritage protection legislation, co-designed with First Nations Australians. I have to be very careful as the decision maker under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act not to give opinions about matters that might come before me. If I give an opinion, that can mean a particular decision I make is thrown out of court, and we get perhaps even the opposite decision to the one that people are asking about in the case that you're describing. So I'm not going to comment, not today or at all, about individual cases that may come before me for decision making, but the general comment I want to make about First Nations cultural heritage in Australia is we are so lucky to be so rich in First Nations cultural heritage. Of course, we need to have better systems for protecting it that don't lead to appalling, shameful outcomes like Juukan Gorge.
Will you be making any kind of comment at some stage in the future on this particular case?
I'll make comment when I'm legally allowed to do that about any case. I won't engage in speculation. It's not me in my job. I'm not allowed to offer you an opinion on things that I will be the legal decision maker.
Okay, our next question is from Josh Butler from The Guardian.
Hi, Minister. Josh Butler from The Guardian. Thank you for your speech. I wanted to follow up Mike's earlier question on the Samuels review and logging. The report today identifies the pace of land clearing as a major problem. Nearly all of the land clearing in, I think, the last century was not referred for federal government approval. Does this need to be addressed? Do we need more federal oversight? Is there any way this logging exemption can possibly continue based on what's in this report today?
I understand why people are super keen for me to be talking about specifics on regional forestry agreements and other areas. It is way too early in the term of the new government for me to be doing that. I am 6 weeks into this job. We are 6 weeks into a new government. We need to talk to state and territory governments in detail about some of the land clearing issues that we face as a nation. We need to consult widely on legislative reforms that we might propose. I'm not going to preempt those discussions by making individual comments about issues like that.
Now, Minister, it's nearly 1:30. We still have a few journalists on the list. Would you be happy to stay a few more minutes to answer their questions?
Yeah, sure.
Wonderful. Okay.
I can't think of anything I'd rather do. I just hope the next few questions are really hard, so I enjoy it.
Yeah. Chloe Bruce from Network 10.
Thank you. Chloe Boris from 10 News First. When we talk about funding this, we know that there is $1 trillion of debt. So realistically, how can Australia fund significant environmental reform, and how high is it on the list of priorities when there are so many challenges facing Australians right now?
I think it's very high on the list of priorities for most Australians to have a clean and healthy environment that they can hand on to their kids and grandkids. And we've already made substantial investment announcements, including, as I mentioned, $1.2 billion over coming years to restore and repair the Great Barrier Reef, the money for threatened species, money for recycling, Indigenous protected areas, Indigenous ranges, land care ranges, and there's a list of commitments that we've made that we will fund. We made those promises before the last election. We will fund those promises, and they will deliver good results for the environment.
But based on the announcements that you've made today following the report, did you have to ring Jim Chalmers and say, hey, we need some extra dollars?
No. And the other thing I would say about this is part of this is about getting economic settings right. So we will see in coming years a desire from business, for example, to invest in carbon credits. If we make carbon credits have the dual benefit of protecting and restoring biodiversity, then we get an environmental win out of a business decision that Australian businesses want to make anyway. They want to say to their shareholders, not only are we reducing our carbon pollution liabilities, we're also investing in the environment because we know that our customers and our shareholders care about that.
Next question is from Tess Economou from AAP. And Tess, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your surname.
It's okay. Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. Tess Economou from AAP. You spoke about how trust had been undermined in environmental laws. How will the government work to restore that?
Well, I think having a transparent and inclusive process for reforming the laws that aren't working now is a really good first step. And, releasing things like this, not keeping things like this hidden for months at a time, is a really good step as well. We need to be accountable to the Australian people for what's happening in our environment. If we continue on the trajectory that we are on now, we'll see more threatened species, we'll see drier rivers, we'll see degraded landscape, we'll see reefs dying. The path we're on now is not sustainable for this country. And I hope that when Australians see us taking serious action, we'll begin to restore their faith.
Tim Shaw from the National Press Club Board.
Thanks, Jane. Minister Tim Shaw, member of the National Press Club Board. 40 years ago, the founder of the Greens political party, Dr Bob Brown, remarked of Bob Hawke that he was Australia's environmental Prime Minister. He added to the Wild Rivers National Park, the Franklin River, and anyone that's been down there knows that was a very brave and important decision. The protests will continue. You saw them this morning at the National Press Club. How do you embrace the voices of those that don't trust your government yet or ever? How do you get them as part of that communications framework? They don't trust local government on environmental decisions, state governments, 2 elections coming up in the next 6 to 9 months. How do you address the community voices that Teal independents have clearly connected? That was on climate. The next will be environment. How do you respond?
Well, that's a great question. I think the first thing to say is I really respect and admire people who protest on environmental issues, as long as they do it within the law. I think it's a really good thing to show political leaders across the board that Australians care about the environment. The second thing I'd say is we in Labor are really proud of the Hawke legacy, the legacy of previous Labor governments. And I think amongst my colleagues, there's a really strong sense that we want to add to that legacy. I'm not going to start talking about individual places and projects now, but the biggest change is we've moved from a government that was hiding bad news, deliberately acting against the environment, to a government that wants to be open and transparent and collaborative and consultative and actually deliver better environmental outcomes. That's the change.
Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
Thanks, Minister. We now know things are much worse than we thought they were going to be. Isn't the fastest way to cut down on carbon emissions just simply to say, right, no more coal mines? It's all different. You know, there is a reason. There's a reason that absolves you from all previous qualifications that you've given. It's something new.
No, we're not going to start breaking promises. And I think any government that 6 or 7 weeks into its new term starts breaking promises is headed for trouble. We made a promise on zero net emissions with an interim target of 43% carbon pollution reduction. We will keep that promise. On the issue of new coal mines, mining's been a really important part of Australia's prosperity for decades, for generations in fact. And mining will continue to be an important part of Australia's prosperity. There are some people who would say we shouldn't have any mining anywhere. It's just not a sustainable or reasonable proposition for a modern economy like Australia's to say that. We are responsible for the carbon pollution that we emit here in Australia. Of course we need to take account of that. Of course we need to reduce it. We have ambitious targets for reducing it. And we need to be part of a global effort as well. Having ambitious domestic targets allows us to be more activist in the international sphere with countries that continue to see very substantial increases in their domestic pollution emission. But just as, Korea, Japan, Germany, America, that export cars to the world, aren't responsible for the emissions of every car they export, we are responsible for our domestic emissions, and that's why we are focused on bringing down our domestic emissions.
So Australian coal is good coal?
I'm not going to have a game where you put words in my mouth. That's really not productive.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review.
Thank you. And also Vice President of the Press Club. Minister, thanks for your...
Just saying, Jane.
I'm sorry.
No, just up for election later this year, which
I want to know what your election policies are.
Very pro-coal, for one thing. Anyway, particularly in the Canberra cold here at the moment. Back to your speech, and you talked about increasing the national estate and protecting 30% of land and oceans by 2030. What's the current, baseline that we're starting from in terms of that protection, and what does protection actually mean? What does it look like? Is it about acquiring land from private landowners and making it national parks? Is it about putting restrictions on activities such as land clearing or logging, extractive industry, buying out commercial fishing licences, that sort of thing? Can you give us a bit of a sense of what you're actually looking at doing in that space?
Yeah, I can. We're actually doing pretty well on oceans. In fact, we've already hit and exceeded the target on oceans. On land, we are still a fair way off. We're at around a quarter, and you think, oh, well, you know, the difference between it's kind of, you know, 26, 27% and 30%, that's not much. It's quite a lot when you talk about the whole Australian landmass, and the kind of low-hanging fruit has already been done. So it won't be easy to expand the national estate, and we'll look at all sorts of ways of doing it. We'll definitely be looking at ways to expand Indigenous protected areas. We've already set funding aside for that. There's other areas that are potentially in consideration for World Heritage listing. We'd love to work with state and territory governments on additional national parks they might be considering. So there are a variety of ways that we can do it. But it is, I think, important, as I said to the earlier question, that when we're thinking about area, we're not just thinking about area. We need to think when we protect an area, how do we also manage what's happening on that area? Like, it's not much good if we're protecting an area that's you know, got foxes and cats and you know, in the top end water buffalo continuing to kill native species on that land, or invasive weeds taking over. So we need to increase the area of land. We also need to increase the way, or improve the way, that we are looking after that land. And so that involves additional area. It also involves more Indigenous ranges, more land care, more science. We're doing such amazing things, you know. We're protecting in small amounts little areas, you know, northwest New South Wales, you know, setting aside areas where cute little hopping things are being released back into the environment. And, you know, we're bringing species back from the brink of extinction. We know how to do that. We've actually got the science, we've got the know-how. By committing to increasing the area of land where we're doing this and increasing the standard of that protection, we could have a huge impact on our natural environment.
Thank you. I'm sure the cute little hopping things will thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Vice President Tillett, and thank you, Minister, for your address today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so
much. Please join me in thanking Tanya Peterson.